What happened to all of the great civilizations in America prior to colonization? If we are to believe the accepted history of systematic education, America was a wasteland full of savages who contributed nothing to the history of the world. But if this were true, why did the government, along with institutions like the Smithsonian, work so hard to destroy the remains of prior civilizations? Where else in modern history have they done this? Usually when ancient monuments are found, institutions respect them, maintain them, and reserve them. But not in America. The remnant of hundreds of nations, systematically and purposely destroyed. Why didn't France destroy the pyramids after they invaded Egypt? This would seem to be the approach that these institutions take in places like Egypt or the Middle East. Why are the pyramids worth saving but the mounds are not? What secrets were lying in the mounds that these institutions were intent to annihilate? To let them tell it, the mounds were built by an unknown civilization centuries before the Indians. But how could this be? According to their own story, mound civilizations like Cahokia lasted up until a century before European contact. The Etowah Mounds in Georgia, Spiro Mounds in Oklahoma, and Moundville, Alabama are stated by their own accounts to have lasted until at least the year 1500. Professional academics say that Native Americans have no idea who built the mounds, that they were already here when they arrived. Why would they say this? Wasn't it their ancestors who built the mounds? If their ancestors didn't build the mounds, whose did? This question threatens to undermine the entire credibility of accepted academic world history unto this day.
Too proud to wait, the beginning of the shape of things to come. Let's start to run, my days to come. Let's start to run, my days to come. Let's start to run, life has begun, life has begun, days to come. Let's start
Many people would find it quite interesting that some of the largest cities in modern America are built right over the ruins of the prior indigenous civilization, virtually bringing truth to the trope, built upon an Indian burial ground. These cities include the largest and most populous cities on the North American continent, from the highly significant to the seemingly insignificant. Starting with the two most populated cities in North America, Mexico City and New York City. Before the arrival of the conquistador, Mexico City was one of the most impressive cities in the world. Quote, from The Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz Castillo. When we saw so many cities and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land, we were amazed and said that it was like the enchantments, on account of the great towers and quays and buildings rising from the water, and all built of masonry. And some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. I do not know how to describe it. Seeing things as we did that had never been heard of or seen before, not even dreamed about. End quote. Continuing. The city was divided into 4 zones or camps. Each camp was divided into 20 districts. Bernal Diaz also reported that the streets were wide enough for 10 horses. Surrounding the raised causeways were artificial floating gardens, and the canal waterways and gardens of plants, shrubs, and trees. The Calpulli were divided by channels used for transportation, with wood bridges that were removed at night. The sheer magnitude of this metropolis stands in the very face of the assertion that these people were savages, for as well documented and restored as many of the pre-Columbian monuments are in this area, the narrative that these people were uncivilized amounts to a targeted fallacy perpetuated by the crafty Council of Scoundrels. A principal objective of the Council of Scoundrels was to destroy and repurpose the histories, ledgers, and chronicles of these people. It's important to note that the Aztec or Mexica Empire was the first empire to fall due to Spanish colonization. Following this, their neighbors to the east, the Maya, also fell. And in July 1562, Roman Catholic Bishop Diego de Landa Calderon burned all of the Maya manuscripts and codex and rewrote their chronologies, posturing himself as the father of Mayan history. Pun intended.
Sobrevivo sin saber si voy. Sobrevivo sin saber si voy. Sobrevivo sin saber si voy. Sobrevivo sin dónde estoy.
Quote, these people use certain characters or letters with which they wrote in their books about the antiquities and their sciences. We found a great number of books in these letters, and since they contain nothing more than superstitions and falsehoods of the devil, we burned them all, which they took most grievously, and which gave them great pain. End quote. Mayanist William Gates says that 99% of what we know about the Mayan people comes from Diego de Landa. As it turns out, much of de Landa's information concerning the Maya was wildly inaccurate or outright false. The father of Maya history couldn't even produce a valid Mayan alphabet or translated phonology into coherent comprehension. A considerable and misleading issue when looking back on history is the problem of grouping entire regions of people into a single classification based upon perceived modern concepts such as borders and governments. A more accurate way of conceptualizing these factors is by language, cultural sphere of influence, and proximity of closest city-states. In most cases, when referring to these people, whether they be a nation in any part of America, they are referred most often by the name given to them by Europeans and not what they called themselves. As is the case, genetics, language, and realm of influence within a certain period of time is a more accurate way of discerning the differences between groups of people. Be this as it may, generalities concerning extant populations and their classifications will always be problematic. For as close as they were in proximity, the people we call Maya and the people labeled Aztec or Mexica spoke completely different languages. The cardinal differences between these two cultures is that the Maya was not centralized around the capital city, as was the Aztec capital, but rather spread in city-states throughout the Yucatan and Central America. A branch of the Uto-Aztecan language family, in which we recall from last episode shares a phonetic relationship with North Africa, is the tongue spoken by these people, while the several languages of the Maya are more predominant to the east in the Yucatan Peninsula and to the south in Central America. So generalizing these groups of people as one and the same should be avoided in terms of language, culture, and origins. A rather broad yet speculative assertion could be drawn by the consensus gathering of linguistics and legend referring to the so-called Aztec people. According to their own legend, the families who founded Aztlan, the home place of the Mexica, came from the place of 7 caves and migrated from that point to found the great Mexica midwater metropolis. Linguistically, the Aztec Mexica origins point to the American Southwest. This group is more ethnically related to the Toltec to the north rather than the Maya to the east and to the south. During the era of colonial expansion, Mexico City was quite possibly the largest and most populous city in the Americas, as it is unto this day. In the centuries following the Spanish invasion, the lake that surrounded the capital was subsequently drained, and the city was built atop the ruins. Since this moment, the land of Mexico City has been sinking hundreds of feet into the earth and is highly susceptible to earthquakes.
Take a step inside the mind of man with no time to lose, cause he don't believe in time, he know what it's time to do. Get the breaking shackles, taking gambles, make him handle Jacob's ladder. Haters rampant, fake his fashion, fate is happen. Make a caption, change the channel, take a stand and fade the castle. Make it fast, make it last, so baby you won't make it past the first stage. Your story ended on the first page. What a fine group of animals the earth made. We've been locked since they put us in the first cage, so we lash out in a fit of hurt rage. But I've been around since the first age, so I walk around the stage like a fucking maze. And you can reach for it only if you timeless, or you can keep yours, but only if you spineless. Shit hit the world like I wrote Dutch, cause it's split down the middle when there's no guts. Fuck a half full, half empty, fill the whole cup. I should be able to drink till I throw up, and a bunch of scary ass rappers with no nuts, all afraid to be honest cause they wanna blow up. But a man who's not built by the circle of time knows there's nothing worse than guilt. If shit comes back around, where did it really go? Think about it, drink about it, let it go. If shit comes back around, where did it really go? Think about it, drink about it, let it go. Be immortal. Keep it rolling.
Contrasting viewpoints regarding the connection between the Toltec and Aztec origins have been a source of dispute between modern historians. While most historians have agreed that the Aztec histories were amalgamated with mythologies, their methodologies for discerning will forever be clouded by chronological obscurity. Quote, modern scholars debate whether the Aztec narratives of Toltec history should be given credence as descriptions of actual historical events. While all scholars acknowledge that there is a large mythological part of the narrative, some maintain that by using critical comparative method, some level of historicity can be salvaged from the sources. Others maintain that continued analysis of the narratives as sources of actual history is futile and hinders access to actual knowledge of the culture of Tuya de Allende. Other controversies relating to the Toltecs include the question of how best to understand the reasons behind the perceived similarities in architecture and iconography between the archaeological site of Tuya and the Maya site of Chichen Itza. Researchers are yet to reach a consensus in regards to the degree or direction of influence between these two sites. End quote. Pre-Columbian versus pre-classical versus classical are not pictures clearly drawn today. As a consequence, much of the field is divided. Quote, the historicist school of thought persisted well into the 20th century, represented in the works of scholars such as David Carrasco, Miguel Leon Portilla, Nigel Davies, and H.B. Nicholson, which all held the Toltecs to have been an actual ethnic group. This school of thought connected the Toltecs to the archaeological site of Tuya, which was taken to be the Tolyan Aztec myth. This tradition assumes that much of central Mexico was dominated by the Toltec Empire between the 10th and 12th century AD. The Aztecs referred to several Mexican city-states as Tolyan, place of reeds, such as Tolyan, Xoloyan. I want to bring special attention to the title Place of Reeds. And from our research, there's a direct connection between the place of reeds, Egypt, and the Red Sea. But there's even more information as to the Aztec homeland being called the Place of Reeds. Quote, Shannon Dugan Iverson, Enduring Toltecs, History and Truth During Aztec to Colonial Transition at Tuya, Hidalgo. Quote, In recent decades, the historicist position has fallen out of favor for a more critical and interpretive approach to the historicity of the Aztec mythical accounts based on the original approach of Brenton. This approach applies a different understanding of the word Toltec to the interpretation of the Aztec sources, interpreting it as largely a mythical and philosophical construct by either the Aztecs or Mesoamericans, generally that serve to symbolize the might and sophistication of several civilizations during the Mesoamerican post-classic period. The Nahuatl word for Toltec, for example, can mean master artisan, as well as inhabitant of Tuya, Hidalgo. But the word Toyan, known as Tuya in modern times, can refer specifically to Tuya, Hidalgo, or more generally to all the great cities through the meaning place of reeds. End quote. Though the legend of these empires abound with much speculation, could genetics possibly bring out more insight into the questions of indigenous Mexican origin? We should not fail to mention that any lineage referred to as indigenous in these genetic studies is Siberian in origin. Every study presumes that the Americas were first inhabited by diverged Siberians who migrated from Asia via Beringia. Relentless consideration of this historical fallacy is essential for gaining contextual insight into the racial bias of modern genomic research, which erroneously miscategorizes the original American race with West African, and further conflates the post-Columbian arrival of Siberians and South Asians with pre-Columbian ancestry. Quote, admixture and population structure in Mexican mestizos based on paternal lineages. From nature.com. Quote, in the non-recombining region of the Y chromosome, there are single nucleotide polymorphisms that establish haplogroups with particular geographical origins. The complex process of admixture that gave us the majority of the current Mexican population known as mestizos can be examined with Y DNA SNPs to establish their paternal ancestry and population structure. We analyzed 18 Y SNPs in 659 individuals from 10 Mexican mestizo populations from different regions of the country. In the total population sample, paternal ancestry was predominantly European, 64.9%, followed by Native American, 30.8%, and African, 4.2%. However, the European ancestry was prevalent in the North and West, 66 to 95%, and conversely, Native American ancestry increased in the center and southeast, 37 to 50%, whereas the African ancestry was low and relatively homogeneous, 0 to 8%. Although this paternal landscape concurs with previous studies based on genome-wide SNPs and STRs, this pattern contrasts with the maternal ancestry, mainly of Native American origin, based on maternal lineages haplogroups. In agreement with historical records, these results confirm a strong gender-biased admixture history between European males and Native American females that gave rise to Mexican mestizos. Genetic relationships and population structure. Quote, in general, the significant paternal population structure inferred here was similar to that observed in a previous study based on YSTRs in Mexican mestizos, in which 3 main regions were distinguished, including the following: North and West, Center and South, and Southeast. Coincidentally, analysis of autosomal STRs has shown a similar structural pattern. And for practical purposes, this could be relevant for epidemiological or human identification purposes. As could be expected, genetic relationships among Mexican mestizos were consistent with the inferred population structure and in agreement with higher European ancestry in the North and West than in the rest of the country. In conclusion, the paternal ancestry of Mexican mestizo males was mainly European, Native American, and African respectively. However, a contrasting pattern of genetic variation based on European and Amerindian ancestry throughout the country was observed, resulting in population structure. A gender-biased admixture pattern was demonstrated in Mexican mestizos, which was characterized by a greater proportion of European men and Native American women. End quote. Documented history and genetic analysis has already proven that the admixture leading to the current template of the so-called Native American or Amerindian is a result of relatively recent admixture. Meaning these natives share little to no relation to the ancient Aztec or Mexica, but rather these studies show a forced racial conversion of these people by the Spanish, in which men exclusively from Spain, and to a lesser extent France and Italy, were impregnating generations of women while simultaneously eradicating nearly all male bloodlines. Today, we have nearly entire regions of Mexico and America who were fathered by a relatively small group of Spanish men, resulting in the combination of genetics present in native mestizo populations today. It must be noted that these populations do not represent the populations of people who lived in these areas before Spanish colonization. These studies can only show a history of admixture since then and the possible genome from those stages of admixture. In other words, the people who formerly inhabited these areas are not clearly represented within the genome of these supplanting populations. We also see that this study highlights the connection between this area of Mexico and the families who first colonized out of Andalusia, Castile, and the borders of the Mediterranean, even North Africa. Unlike the invasion of the Aztec Empire in Mexico City, the America's largest city, the colonization of New York was far less immediate. And due to the variation of different nations scattered throughout the land, rather than one single super city, the colonization of the Northeast spanned throughout the 17th century and was far more difficult to colonize than was Mexico City. We mentioned in an earlier episode how Henry Hudson was one of the first Europeans to land in modern-day New York, but also he was employed by several kingdoms under the guise of being a merchant. As an Englishman, he worked for the Muscovy Company out of Russia, and the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, and the Virginia Company. According to the narrative, Hudson was first hired to find the Northwest Passage to Asia. Although he was one of the first Europeans to actually see New York, the first European to lay claim to the land happened almost a century prior, by Giovanni da Verrazzano. However, Hudson did initiate trade with the local tribes, effectively establishing a trading foothold in the territory for the Dutch, who were the first to set up camp along the Hudson River. And it wouldn't take long before the Dutch started killing Indians. Merchant trading was a primary objective of the heathen. This was a means of supplanting the current population through deceptive trade and falsely incurred debts. But not only false debts, but false transactions. One such transaction that should be considered false was the purchase of the island of Manhattan. Quote, the $24 swindle. Quote, by now it is probably too late to do anything about it, but the unsettling fact remains that the so-called sale of Manhattan Island to the Dutch in 1626 was a totally illegal deal. A group of Brooklyn Indians perpetuated the swindle, and they had no more right to sell Manhattan Island than the present mayor of White Plains would have to declare war on France. When the Manhattan Indians found out about it, they were understandably furious. But by that time, the Dutch had too strong a foothold to be dislodged by the Indians. At any rate, and the eventual arrival of one-way avenues and the Hamburg Heaven Crystal Room was only a matter of time. To understand how this was brought about, it is important to know something about the local Indians of the period. They were all, or almost all, of Algonquin origin. Those who later became known as Manhattans were actually Wekasijiks, who belonged to the Wappinger Confederation. Their main village was Nepekemack, on the site of what is now Yonkers, and they had a fort called the Penachism on the north bank of the Spuyten-Duyvil, or Spewing Devil. They lived in little clusters of igloo-like bark huts along the east bank of the Hudson River and Westchester shore of Long Island Sound, and they used Manhattan, the island of hills, for their hunting and fishing stations. Everybody was happy, that is, except the Wekasijiks. At first they had no idea that their land had been sold out from under them, but then more and more Dutch farmers began to arrive, and their unfenced cattle wandered off across the Indians' land, eating their corn and trampling their crops. And when the Indians complained, they were given a few trinkets in payment and told it was too bad, but the land was no longer theirs. It was then there was absolutely nothing they could do. Even if they had wanted to make a fight about it, the Dutch had guns and they didn't. And the only thing the Indians could do was suddenly try to make the best of an impossible situation. Matters might have continued at a slow boil for some time if it hadn't been that the few of the Dutch violated all the standing orders and began to trade liquor and guns to the Indians in exchange for furs. They found that the Indians, being unaccustomed to liquor, were pushovers for a quick bargain after about one drink. The thing the Dutch didn't realize was the fact that an Indian with a hangover, a gun, and a burning sense of injustice was as dangerous as a platoon of dragoons. The mere sight of a red-eyed, dry-mouthed Indian with a gun in his shaking hand and bits of dirt and grass clinging to his coating of days-old eagle fat should have been enough to warn them to be careful, but wasn't. Inevitably, trouble developed. Massacres were perpetuated by both sides, but as often as not, it was the Dutch who were the aggressors. In one spectacular display of perfidy, they slaughter a whole camp of Wekasijiks who had come to them for protection against the marauding Mohawks, and mangled them so badly that at first it looked like the work of other Indians. As a result, in 1664, when the British fleet shipped in and quietly took New Amsterdam, there were very few Indians left on the island, and those who remained didn't really care about anything. They had succumbed not only to various kinds of disease and to white men, but more disastrously, they had been done in by the Mohawks from up one river and the Canarsies from across another. It should be a lesson to us all. End quote. From the $24 Swindle, AmericanHeritage.com. The Dutch were able to extend their territories to the north, but found trouble sustaining a protective stronghold against Indian attacks. The Dutch grew ever more vulnerable. The inches they took eventually became miles of Indian territory occupied by different nations, who had all been using the land between themselves for generations, with generally no conflict. These tribes had no established history over fighting over hunting grounds or fishing grounds, which they utilized in abundance. Over 50 nations lived within a 50 square mile radius of Long Island. But even within the city itself, its most prominent landmarks are built right over former tribal spots of significance. The central issue around the Dutch failure to maintain control of New Netherland, or Dutch India West, was based in large part because they never established an effective method of general public administration. The majority of their settlements were outposts of the Dutch West India Company, and their director generals like William Kieft or Peter Stuyvesant cared little about fostering peaceful relations with the local natives. Couple this with the growing colonies of the French and English on all sides of the Dutch, tension over trade routes between imperial powers was mounting. During this time, the Dutch had the most influence on the world shipping economy. Their territorial gains over seized Portuguese areas in Brazil allowed them to nearly monopolize the spice trade. Quote, although Iberian writers said that crypto-Jews or Marranos played an important role in the formation of the Dutch East and West India Companies, research has shown that they initially played a minor role but expanded during the period of the Dutch in Brazil. Immigrant Calvinists, or Huguenots, from the Spanish Netherlands did make significant investments in the Dutch West India Company. End quote. The Dutch colonies were never really considered homogeneous in nature. A variety of different types of people lived in their posts, from Africans to Huguenots to crypto-Jews and Marranos. As their domain expanded, maintaining any form of militaristic security became even more difficult for the Dutch West India Company, who supplied very little to no military support for their outposts, which made it easy for King Charles II of England to claim Dutch India holdings for England. The Dutch relinquished New Amsterdam to the English without one drop of bloodshed. The Wekasijiks occupied the location of modern-day Bronx and the northern end of Manhattan between the Harlem and Hudson rivers. However, it was the Canarsie who occupied the southern end of Manhattan who sold their lot to the Dutch. But the Dutch instead took the whole island of Manhattan, never recognizing that other parts of the island were considered communal property. New Amsterdam was constructed directly over occupied territory. For example, Broadway, the oldest north-south corridor in New York City, was a trail used by the Wekasijic for generations before the arrival of the Dutch. Quote, Broadway was originally the Wekasijic Trail, carved into the brush of Manhattan by its Native American inhabitants. This trail originally snaked through swamps and rocks along the length of Manhattan Island. Upon the arrival of the Dutch, the trail was widened and soon became the main road through the island from New Amsterdam at the southern tip. The Dutch explorer and entrepreneur David Peters de Vries gives the first mention of it in his journal for the year 1642, the Wekasijic Road over which the Indians passed daily. The Dutch called it Herenstraat, meaning gentleman's way or gentleman's street, echoing the name of a similar street in Amsterdam, or High Street, or the Highway. It was renamed Broadway after the British took over the city because of its unusual width. Although currently the name of the street is simply Broadway, in a 1776 map of New York City, it is labeled as Broadway Street. End quote. But that's not all. It is estimated that Washington Square Park was built over 20,000 people who lay at rest beneath the arch in Lower Manhattan. But bodies also lay beneath other notable New York landmarks, such as New York University, Columbia University, and the Waldorf Astoria. Even lesser notable locations as well. Montauk and Shinnecock burials in Queens were removed for a Chinese restaurant in 1931. The displacement of these tribes in this region reflect a more complicated genetic history than some of the isolated tribal groups we presented earlier of the American Southwest. The bands along the Northeast Corridor battled with Europeans for centuries, taking up arms with the French and British on different occasions, being used as allies or enemies on one side or the other. As a result, intermarriage among tribes and Europeans was practiced in order to establish land deals. The common practice of tribal leaders arranging a wife as tribute to their European allies. This opened a way for Europeans to commandeer native lands under the notion that the children of European males and Indian women born in subsequent generations would become tribal leaders. By virtue of the Europeans' connection to the invading new-coming government, their mixed children would be elevated as representatives of the Indians. With each succeeding generation, the paternal chieftains incrementally lost more influence until there was a clear separation of hierarchy, which saw tribal leaders descended from European fathers, more specifically, French or English fathers. This marked the change of face for the true American, and the definition of an American would change as well. Although faces and definitions change, the heart of a people will always remain. At the heart of most colonizers was Christianity. But who did the Indians in the Northeast worship.
Sobrevivo sin saber si voy. Sobrevivo sin saber si voy. Sobrevivo sin saber si voy. Sobrevivo si no estoy.
Quote, View of the Hebrews by Ethan Smith, 1823. Quote, They then choose 12 stones for an altar of sacrifice. Some tribes, he observes, choose but 10 men, 10 poles, and 10 stones. Here seems to be an evident allusion to the 12 tribes, and also to some idea of the 10 separate tribes of Israel. Upon the stones of their altar they suffered no tool to pass. No tool might pass upon a certain altar in Israel, the middle joint of the thigh of their game. Dr. Beatty informs, the Indians refused to eat. Thus did ancient Israel, after the angel had touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh and the sinew that shrank. In short, says Dr. Beatty, I was astonished to find so many of the Jewish customs prevailing among them, and began to conclude there was some affinity between them and the Jews. Continuing, Colonel Smith in his history of New Jersey says of another region of Indians, they never eat of the hollow of the thigh of anything they kill. Charlevoix explains of the Indians still further to the north, says he met with people who could not help thinking that the Indians were descended from the Hebrews, and found in everything some affinity between them. Some things he states as on certain meals, neglecting the use of knives, not breaking the bone of the animal they eat, never eating the part under the lower joint of the thigh, but throwing it away. Such are their traditions from their ancient fathers. Other travelers among them speak of their peculiar evening feast, in which no bone of their sacrifice may be broken. No bone might be broken of the ancient Paschal lamb in Israel, which was eaten in the evening. Different men who had been eyewitnesses speak of this and other feasts resembling the feast in Israel, and tell us relative to this peculiar evening feast that if one family cannot eat all they have prepared, a neighboring family is invited to partake with them. And if any of it be still left, it must be burned before the next rising sun. None who read the law of the Passover can doubt the origin of this. End quote. If you recall from the previous episode, we highlighted the exile of the northern tribes into Assyria and how the American Northeast best describes the land of Assyria in terms of biblical accuracy. We know from several documented practices, histories, and languages that the Indians who inhabited this area had traditionally followed the customs of their forefathers, and their routines were unquestionably Hebrew in origin. Why did the Spanish build Mexico City over the ruins of the Aztec Empire? Is there some hidden power released by building over ancient cities? Why was Tenochtitlan destroyed, but the pyramid complex at Teotihuacan restored? The Aztec legend says they come from the place of reeds. Where is the place of reeds located? According to several biblical lexicons, the place of reeds is synonymous with ancient Egypt, the Nile Delta, and the Red Sea, which is referred to as the Sea of Reeds, or Yam Suf. Does this mean the Aztecs could have been from ancient Egypt? How else do we explain the cultural similarities? From the cultivation of corn to the construction of pyramids, even down to the legend of Anubis, the dog who guides spirits into the underworld, is not an African dog as assumed by its image on the walls of Egyptian pyramids, but rather a Mexican hairless Xolo. A dog only found in Mexico is the patron saint of lost souls and the physical embodiment of Anubis. If the current population of central Mexico is not related to the Aztecs, does that mean the people of southeast Mexico are also not related to the Maya? If both of these populations were supplanted, where do their relatives live today? What happened to the Black Mexicans? What happened to the Black Indians found by Verrazano in New York? If the purchase of Manhattan Island is an illegal deal, why is it still being upheld today? How many skyscrapers sit right on top of former Indian burial grounds? Is there a curse that comes along with building over the dead? The answer to these questions and more on the next episode of The Smartest Beast in the Field.